We are glad to see you again. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, we invite you to journey back in time. We will travel to a land built of sand, sun, and water. A civilization that measured its existence not in years, but in thousands of years. This is the story of Egypt, told through the ambitions, strategies, and wills of the great leaders who shaped it. Our story begins not with a person, but with a river. There is a place on earth where life exists on a knife's edge. To the east and west, there is an endless, scorching void of red sand and rock. This is the Deshret, the Red Land, a place of chaos, silence, and death. But running directly through this void is a single, winding ribbon of impossible life. A river so vital that without it, the history we are about to tell would simply not exist. This is the Nile. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously said, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile," but this is not entirely true. The Nile did not just give Egypt its life. It forged its very soul. Every year, like a divine clock, the river would swell from rains far to the south. It would rise above its banks and flood the narrow valley, depositing a thick, rich layer of black silt. The Egyptians called their home Kemet, the Black Land, named after this fertile soil. When the waters receded, the land was reborn, ready for planting. This annual miracle, death by flood, followed by rebirth through soil, became the central metaphor for Egyptian life. It shaped their entire worldview. They saw the universe not as a random collection of events, but as a system of perfect, predictable cycles. The sun rose in the east and died in the west, only to be reborn the next morning. The flood came, receded, and always returned. This cycle was the physical manifestation of their most important concept. Ma'at. Ma'at is a word that means harmony, truth, justice, and cosmic order. It was the fundamental duty of every leader and every person to maintain Ma'at. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet. Chaos, the lie, the destructive nature of the Red Land. The world of the Egyptians was a constant struggle. The order of the Black Land against the chaos of the desert. This geographical duality created a political one. Egypt was not one nation. It was the two lands. In the south, stretching for hundreds of miles, was Upper Egypt. This was a land of high cliffs, a narrow valley, and a harsh, conservative people. They were tough, isolated, and deeply traditional. Their king wore the hedjet, the tall white crown. In the north, where the Nile split into a vast, marshy fan before meeting the Mediterranean Sea, was Lower Egypt. This was the Delta. It was flat, wide, and incredibly fertile. Unlike the isolated south, the people of the Delta were traders, open to the sea and the strange peoples who came from it. Their king wore the Deshret, the red crown. For centuries, these two lands existed as rivals. They had different gods, different customs, and a deep suspicion of one another. The southerner saw the northerner as soft and foreign. The northerner saw the southerner as a primitive Highlander. They spoke the same language but were separated by culture. The land was rich, perhaps the richest in the ancient world. The silt produced effortless surpluses of wheat and barley. This wealth, concentrated in a narrow, easily taxable strip of land, made it a prize beyond imagining. But it was a prize that could not be held by a weak hand. It required a single, unified system of irrigation. It required a single authority to manage the grain stores. It required one ruler to defend the valley from invaders on either side. The two lands were a bow, drawn taut, waiting for a hand strong enough to release the arrow of history. That hand would emerge from the harsh, traditional south. Around 3100 BC, a new line of powerful kings rose in Upper Egypt from the city of Thutmose. They were warriors, hardened by the valley's cliffs and the desert heat. We do not know the names of the first kings who dreamed of conquest, but we know the name of the man who finished the job. He was a conqueror, a unifier, and a brilliant strategist. He would not just defeat the armies of the north. He would symbolically capture its very soul. He would be the first man to wear both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, forging a new terrifying symbol of absolute power, the double crown of a united Egypt. He was, in the memory of his people, the first true king. His name was Narmer. Later traditions would call this first king Menes, which means he who endures. But archaeology gives us a more concrete name, found carved into stone, Narmer. It is almost certain they were the same man. Narmer was a product of the south, a king from Hierakonpolis, the city of the hawk. This was the sacred center for the falcon god Horus, and Narmer saw himself as the living embodiment of that god. He was not just a man seeking power. He believed he was a god fulfilling his destiny to bring order to the chaos of the two lands. The conquest of the north was not a single, swift battle. It was likely a brutal, grinding campaign that lasted a generation. The north, the delta, was wealthy and populous, but it was a flat, open land of marshes and rival city-states. It had no single leader. Narmer's south was a unified, linear kingdom, hardened by the desert, and fanatically loyal to their god-king. He wielded an army with a single purpose. Narmer's strategy was one of unstoppable momentum. He pushed north, subduing town after town, until he finally smashed the last resistance and brought the red crown of the delta under his control. But it is what he did after the victory that reveals his genius, not as a mere warlord, but as a true founder of a nation. In his ancient capital, archaeologists discovered an object that tells the story better than any words. It is known today as the Narmer Palette. It is perhaps the single most important artifact ever found in Egypt, for it is the founding document of their civilization. It is not art, it is a declaration, a piece of political propaganda carved in stone. On one side, we see Narmer, depicted as a powerful, muscular figure, larger than any other man. He wears the tall, white crown of his native south. He stands, legs apart, grasping a kneeling, naked enemy by the hair. This enemy is the defeated chieftain of the north. In his other hand, Narmer raises a heavy mace, ready to deliver the final brutal blow. This is the classic smiting pose that Egyptian pharaohs would copy for the next 3,000 years. But the symbolism is even deeper. Above the enemy, the god Horus, as a falcon, is seen perched on a cluster of papyrus reeds, the plant of the north. The falcon holds a rope, attached to the nose of a human head that grows from the reeds. The message is clear and terrifying. My god Horus has captured the spirit of the northern marshes and delivers its people to me. Then we look at the other side of the palette. The war is over. We see Narmer again, but now he is changed. He wears the distinctive, curling red crown of the very land he has conquered. He has not destroyed the north. He has absorbed it. He has become its king. He walks in a solemn procession to inspect the spoils of his victory. 2 long, neat rows of headless corpses, their severed heads placed carefully between their legs. Below this, we see the most famous image. 2 mythical, long-necked beasts, part leopard, part serpent. Their necks twist and intertwine, forming a perfect circle in the center. Their handlers struggle to keep them in check. These 2 beasts represent Upper and Lower Egypt. Once rivals, now bound together, united and controlled by the will of the new king. This palette was Narmer's press release to the world. It stated, in unambiguous terms, the 2 lands are one. The chaos is over. I am in control. But Narmer's final act was his masterstroke. A lesser king might have ruled from his southern homeland, treating the north as a conquered province. Another might have moved to the northern capital to enjoy its wealth. Narmer did neither. He chose a location of perfect strategic genius. He ordered a new fortified capital city to be built on the very border, the exact point where the southern valley meets the northern delta. He called it Ineb-Hej, the White Walls, a fortress of white-painted mud brick. Later it would be known as Memphis. According to legend, Narmer's engineers performed a godlike feat. They diverted the entire course of the Nile River to create a dry, protected plain for his new city. Whether true or not, the story shows his power. From this central, unassailable position, he could control the entire river, the lifeblood of both lands. Memphis would remain the administrative and spiritual capital of Egypt for the next 3 millennia. It was the balance of the two lands, and from its throne, Narmer and his descendants would rule. Narmer had done more than conquer territory. He had created the world's first nation-state. He had forged the idea of the pharaoh, a single man, both human and divine, whose personal health and strength were tied directly to the health of the nation. He was the shepherd who kept Marat and held the forces of Isfet at bay. He had built the kingdom. But he had also created a new problem. A king who is a god cannot simply be buried in the sand. A divine ruler needed a divine tomb. The office he created demanded a new kind of monument, one that would not just house his body, but declare his power over death itself. The stage was set for the next great innovators in Egyptian history. For nearly 4 centuries after Narmer, his successors were laid to rest in the traditional way. Their tombs were called mastabas, from the Arabic word for bench. They were large, rectangular, flat-topped structures made of mud brick, built over a burial chamber deep in the earth. They were impressive, but they were not permanent. Mud brick, even the strongest, eventually crumbles. The desert winds and the passage of time reclaim it. These tombs were mortal. This was the challenge that faced the first king of the Third Dynasty, a pharaoh named Djoser. Djoser inherited a stable and prosperous nation. The unity Narmer had forged with violence, Djoser wanted to cement in stone. He was a powerful and effective ruler, but his true legacy would be secured not by a man of royal blood, but by a man of genius who was born a commoner. His name was Imhotep. In the entire record of human history, Imhotep is the first genius whose name has come down to us. He was the world's first true polymath, a man of impossible talent. He was Djoser's vizier, the prime minister of the entire kingdom. He was a doctor writing medical texts so advanced they were still studied 1,000 years later. And, most importantly, he was the high priest of Heliopolis, the city of the sun god Ra. When King Djoser commissioned Imhotep to build his tomb, Imhotep, the visionary, saw the humble mud brick mastaba and was profoundly dissatisfied. A king who was a living god, the son of Ra, could not be buried in a slowly dissolving mound of earth. He deserved something as permanent as the stars themselves. Imhotep's first innovation was revolutionary, and it would change the world forever. He decided to abandon mud brick and build the king's tomb entirely out of stone. It is difficult to overstate what a massive leap this was. Before this moment, stone had been used in Egypt, but only for small elements: a doorway, a single paving slab, a vessel. No one in the history of the world had ever attempted to build a large-scale monumental structure from thousands of precisely cut blocks. Imhotep had to invent the very process of a stone quarry. He had to organize the manpower to cut the limestone, the transport to move the blocks, and the geometry to make them fit. He was, in effect, creating the science of engineering from nothing. He chose a high plateau in the desert, at a place called Saqqara, overlooking the capital of Memphis. At first, his plan was modest. He would build a traditional mastaba, but make it of stone, larger and more permanent than any before. He built it, a perfect square of gleaming Tura limestone. And then, he changed his mind. Perhaps, as high priest of the sun, he felt it wasn't enough for his king to be under the ground. He had to rise above it. He built a second, smaller mastaba directly on top of the first, and then a third, smaller still, and a fourth. He continued, one on top of the other, until 6 steps rose from the desert, reaching a height of over 200 feet, or 62 meters. It was the tallest structure on Earth. It dominated the horizon, a man-made mountain of white limestone that captured the light of the sun. He had not built a tomb. He had built a stairway. This was its true religious purpose. The step pyramid was a literal machine for resurrection. In the Egyptian belief system, the king had two souls. His Ba, which was his personality, and his Ka, which was his divine life force. After death, his Ka needed to ascend to the heavens to join the gods. Imhotep's pyramid was a physical ramp, a staircase for Djoser's soul to climb and take his place among the imperishable stars of the northern sky. But Imhotep's genius did not stop there. A king needed more than a tomb. He needed his entire palace for the afterlife. So, Imhotep surrounded the pyramid with a massive stone enclosure wall, nearly a mile in circumference. Inside this wall, he built an entire eternal city for his king. He constructed a replica of Djoser's palace, chapels for the gods, and great courtyards. But it was all a stunning, silent stage set. The buildings were dummies, solid stone facades with no interiors. The doors were carved in place, frozen open. They were not for the living. They were for the king's Ka to use in the next world. He even built a special courtyard for the Hatshepsut festival, a jubilee where the aging king would run a ritual course to prove his physical fitness. Imhotep built the course in stone, so Djoser's spirit could run it and be rejuvenated for all eternity. And in a small, hidden chamber called the Serdab, Imhotep placed a life-sized, seated statue of Djoser. Two small holes were drilled through the wall at the statue's eye level, allowing the king's spirit, frozen in stone, to gaze out and watch the rituals performed in his honor forever. Imhotep's creation was a total success. It was a city of the dead, an engine for eternity, and the ultimate statement of the pharaoh's power over life and death. Djoser had achieved his immortality, and Imhotep, the commoner, had started an architectural revolution. He was so revered that, 2,000 years later, the Egyptians worshipped him as the god of medicine and wisdom. He was the first great leader of the mind, and his stone legacy would set the stage for an obsession that would define the next generation of kings. Imhotep's stone stairway was a challenge thrown down to the future. It proved that humanity could build a mountain, but it was still just a series of steps. The challenge was answered by the founder of the next great era, the Fourth Dynasty. His name was Sneferu. Unlike many pharaohs, who are remembered as distant godlike figures, Egyptian history recalls Sneferu as a benevolent, wise, and approachable ruler. He was the good king, but beneath this kindness was an iron will and an architectural ambition that dwarfed even Djoser's. Sneferu was not satisfied with a staircase. He looked to the sun god Ra and saw something else, the rays of the sun slanting down to the earth in a perfect straight line. He wanted to build that. His obsession with finding this perfect form would turn him into the greatest pyramid builder in history, though his path was one of remarkable public failure. His first attempt was at a site called Midam. He began by constructing a large step pyramid, similar to Djoser's, but grander. Then he decided to fix it. He ordered his workers to fill in the steps with stone and cover the entire structure with a smooth outer casing of polished limestone to create a straight-sided pyramid. The experiment was a spectacular disaster. The new casing stones were not properly supported and were laid at too steep an angle. At some point, either during construction or shortly after, the entire outer shell collapsed, leaving the crumbling inner core exposed, as it remains to this day. A king of lesser ambition would have seen this as a terrible omen. Sneferu saw it as a lesson in physics. Undeterred, he moved his entire royal court and workforce to a new site, Dashur. He would try again. Here, he began what is now called the Bent Pyramid. His architects, having learned from Midam, started at a steep, ambitious 54-degree angle. The pyramid rose quickly, a perfect, gleaming slope. But as it reached half its intended height, disaster struck again. The ground at Dashur was unstable. The immense weight of the structure, built on soft clay and gravel, began to shift. Worse, the internal chambers, built within the pyramid's body, began to crack under the strain. The entire project was threatening to implode. A lesser king might have abandoned the project and executed his engineers. Sneferu, the practical leader, adapted. He ordered a drastic mid-construction change. The angle of the pyramid was suddenly and famously bent, reduced to a much safer, more stable 43 degrees for the remaining half of its height. The pyramid was saved, but it was a compromise. It was not the perfect form he craved. The good king was still not satisfied. He now had one collapsed pyramid and one compromised, bent pyramid. He had spent decades and vast resources, and he still did not have his perfect eternal home. So he began a third time. Just a short distance away, he ordered the construction of another massive pyramid, known today as the Red Pyramid. This time there was no experimentation. There was no unstable ground. His engineers applied all their hard-won lessons. They started the pyramid from the very beginning at the proven, safe, and stable 43-degree angle. It rose uninterrupted to become the world's first successful, smooth-sided true pyramid. In his relentless quest, Sneferu had quarried and moved more cubic meters of stone, over 3.6 million, than any other pharaoh in the history of Egypt, including his son. He had failed twice, but in doing so, he perfected the art. He was the ultimate innovator, the man who, through trial, error, and immense national effort, had finally captured a sunbeam in stone. He taught his son, Khufu, a valuable lesson. Khufu inherited a kingdom that was stable, wealthy, and most importantly, now possessed the perfect architectural blueprint. He did not need to be an innovator like his father. He only needed to be an executor. History does not remember Khufu as good. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years later, claimed Khufu was a cruel tyrant who bankrupted his country and enslaved his people to build his monument of vanity. This is almost certainly false propaganda, but it hints at a different kind of truth. Khufu was not a benevolent experimenter. He was a man of singular, terrifying focus. He would take his father's final, perfect design and execute it once, on a scale that would stagger the human imagination for all time. He chose a new site, a high, solid limestone plateau that offered a perfect, unshakable foundation. Giza. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is not a story of invention. It is a story of logistics, mathematics, and absolute state control. For 20 years, a nation of tens of thousands of workers labored on this single project. We now know from the excavation of the workers' village at Giza that these were not slaves. They were free people, farmers who paid their taxes to the state not with grain, but with labor during the months when the Nile flood made farming impossible. They were organized into teams with names like the Friends of Khufu. They were housed in barracks, fed the best bread, beer, and meat, and given expert medical care. The pyramid was the ultimate national project. It consumed the entire output of the state. Khufu's vizier, his nephew Himiunu, was the master architect, coordinating quarries hundreds of miles away, fleets of ships to transport granite, and an army of surveyors, masons, and laborers on site. They moved, with stunning precision, 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 80 tons. They aligned the structure to the cardinal points with an accuracy that modern builders would struggle to match. This was not the act of a vain tyrant. This was a statement. It was the physical manifestation of Marat. It proved that the pharaoh was the master of order, that he could command the entire nation, its resources, and its very landscape, to build a perfect, rational, eternal mountain in the face of the desert's chaos. Khufu had created the ultimate symbol, a monument so perfect and so vast that it would never be equaled. His son, Khufu and his grandson Menkaure would build their own magnificent pyramids beside his, along with the Great Sphinx, but the age of giants was passing. The obsession with stone had reached its absolute peak, and the resources of the kingdom had been poured into this single, perfect, silent plateau. The age of the Great Pyramids had exhausted the Old Kingdom. The absolute, godlike power of Khufu could not be sustained. The state fractured, plunging Egypt into its first intermediate period, a time of chaos and civil war. Order was eventually restored, leading to the Middle Kingdom, a time of reunification and cultural refinement. But this new stability was shattered by an invasion. A foreign people from the east, known as the Hyksos, swept into the fertile delta. They brought with them terrifying new technologies of war: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and bronze weapons. For the first time, Egyptians were ruled by foreigners. This occupation was a deep, national humiliation. It lasted for over a century, until a line of warrior princes from the southern city of Thebes began a brutal war of liberation. When they finally drove the Hyksos out, they were not the same people. The trauma of the invasion had forged a new Egypt. This was the birth of the new kingdom. Its pharaohs were not aloof gods in stone. They were emperors, generals, the leaders of a new professional army. Their duty was no longer just to build a tomb, but to expand Egypt's borders, to conquer, and to create an empire that would ensure no one could ever violate the sacred Black Land again. Into this new world of warriors and empire builders, a child was born who would challenge all its rules. Her name was Hatshepsut. Her pedigree was perfect. She was the daughter of the great warrior pharaoh, Thutmose I, and the great royal wife. She was pure, divine right royalty. She was married, as was tradition, to her half-brother, Thutmose II. He was a frail and sickly ruler, and when he died after a short reign, the throne was left in a precarious position. The only male heir was a small child, also named Thutmose, born to a lesser wife of the harem. This child, Thutmose III, was officially crowned king. But a boy could not rule an empire. Hatshepsut, as the dowager queen and the child's aunt and stepmother, was named regent. A regent's role is simple: to hold power for the king until he comes of age, and then to step aside. For the first few years of her stepson's reign, Hatshepsut played this role perfectly. She was the dutiful queen, the protector of the boy king. But Hatshepsut was profoundly ambitious. She believed the throne was hers by divine right, not his. She looked at her weak husband, and then at her stepson, who had no royal blood from his mother's side, and she saw an opportunity. She would not be the power behind the throne. She would be the throne. In the 7th year of the boy king's reign, she made her move. It was a masterstroke of political propaganda, a coup not by military force, but by theology. She declared that her stepson's reign was illegitimate. She began to circulate a new stunning story, which she soon had carved onto the walls of her temples for all to see. It was the story of her true father. The myth stated that the great god of the empire, Ammonius Ra, had desired her mother, the queen. The god, she claimed, had taken the physical form of her father, Thutmose I, and entered the queen's chambers. He had revealed his divine form to her, and she had conceived a child. That child was Hatshepsut. The message was revolutionary. She was not merely the descendant of a king. She was the direct biological daughter of the king of the gods. Her claim to the throne was not through marriage. It was from the creator of the universe himself. How could a mere boy, born of a commoner, compete with that? She staged a coronation and was crowned as a full pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. She was now co-ruler with her stepson, but her divine claim made her the senior dominant king. She then faced a new problem. In the Egyptian mind, the office of kingship, the very idea of the pharaoh, was inherently mythologically male. The king was the living Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris. There was no word for a female queen in the way we mean it. Hatshepsut's solution was brilliant and pragmatic. She did not change the office. She changed herself. She began to adopt the full, five-fold titulary of a male king. In statues and reliefs, her image began to transform. She was depicted in the traditional male kilt. Her body became muscular. She was shown wearing the great crowns of Egypt and, most famously, the ceremonial false beard of the pharaoh. This was not an attempt to trick people into thinking she was a man. Everyone knew she was a woman. This was a political statement. She was signaling that she was not a queen. She was king. She was filling a male role, and she would wear its uniform. For 22 years, she ruled over a prosperous and peaceful Egypt. While her new kingdom ancestors had been defined by war, she was defined by trade and building. Her masterwork was the famous expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious, wealthy kingdom far to the south, likely on the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. Her ships returned laden not with slaves or plunder, but with the greatest luxuries of the ancient world. Mountains of myrrh and frankincense trees, which she had dug up and replanted in Egypt, gold, ebony, and exotic animals. She had the entire journey recorded on the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple, Deir el-Bahari, portraying it not as a trade mission, but as a glorious conquest for her divine father, Ammonius. This temple was her masterpiece. It was a stunning terrace structure, built into the side of a massive cliff, which looked less like a building and more like a part of nature itself. It was her final, permanent piece of propaganda. She was one of the greatest pharaohs in history, a woman who bent the entire religious and political system of her time to her will, not with an army but with a story. But as she ruled in peace, the boy king she had sidelined was growing up. He was not a politician. He was a warrior biding his time, learning his craft in the army, and waiting in the shadows. His name was Thutmose III, and his time was coming. When Hatshepsut died, after 22 years of her dominant rule, Thutmose III was no longer a child. He was a man in his early 30s, in his physical prime, and he had spent his entire adult life in the barracks of the army. While his stepmother had been building temples and sending trade missions, Thutmose had been training, learning the craft of war, and quietly commanding the respect of Egypt's military. He had been a coiled spring, and with her death, he was finally released. The world tested him immediately. Hatshepsut's reign had been one of peace, but in the new kingdom, peace was often interpreted as weakness. Far to the north, in the lands of the Levant, a powerful coalition of Canaanite kings and princes saw their opportunity. Led by the formidable king of Kadesh, they massed their armies at the city of Megiddo, a strategic fortress that controlled the main trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. It was a full-scale rebellion, a declaration that the age of Egyptian dominance was over. Thutmose's response was lightning fast. He had spent 2 decades waiting for this moment. He assembled Egypt's new professional army of infantry and elite chariot corps and marched north. This was his first campaign as sole pharaoh. It was not just a battle. It was the defining test of his life. He arrived at the foot of the Mount Carmel range. His scouts and captured spies informed him that the rebel army was waiting on the other side. His generals laid out the options. There were 3 passes through the mountains to reach Megiddo. 2 of them were wide, safe, and open, one to the north and one to the south. They would allow the army to march in formation. His generals were unanimous. They must take one of these safe routes. But there was a third option, a narrow, rocky ravine called the Aruna Pass. It was so narrow, his generals warned, that the army would be forced to march horse after horse and man after man. It was a death trap, a perfect place for an ambush that could annihilate the entire Egyptian army. It was here that Thutmose revealed his character. He was a gambler, a brilliant tactician who understood the mind of his enemy. He held a council of war and listened to his general's cautious advice. Then he stood and made a declaration. He swore a royal oath that he would not cower like a coward. He knew his enemies. They were gathered at the mouths of the easy roads, he reasoned, believing he would never be insane enough to take the Central Pass. Therefore, that is exactly where he would go. My Majesty shall proceed along this Aruna road, he declared. Let him who will among you go upon these roads you speak of. But I shall go this way. It was a masterful stroke of leadership. He had shamed them, inspired them, and committed them to his audacious plan. And he did not lead from the rear. The next morning, Thutmose III, in his gleaming gold chariot, personally led his army into the narrow pass. The tension of that march must have been unbearable. For nearly 12 hours, the best of the Egyptian army was trapped in a single-file line, vulnerable and blind. But Thutmose's gamble paid off. When his vanguard emerged from the pass, they found the plain empty. Just as he had predicted, the entire rebel army was camped miles away, lazily guarding the northern and southern entrances. The surprise was total. The rebel kings, in a panic, fled their camp and scrambled to get inside the walls of Megiddo, famously being pulled up the battlements by their clothes. Here, Thutmose faced an unexpected failure. His own troops, seeing the abandoned enemy camp filled with gold, silver, and magnificent chariots, broke formation and began to plunder. Thutmose was furious. This single act of indiscipline cost him a total victory, as the enemy leaders were now safe behind the city's massive walls. But the strategist adapted. Thutmose immediately ordered a siege. It was one of the first great systematic sieges in recorded history. His soldiers built a massive wall around Megiddo, trapping the trappers. They cut down every fruit tree in the surrounding area, a move of grim, psychological warfare. The siege lasted for 7 long months. Finally, the starving city surrendered. Thutmose's victory was absolute, but it was the peace he imposed that proved his genius. He took the defeated king's treasure, but not their lives. Instead, he took their sons. He brought the young princes back to Egypt, not as prisoners, but as royal guests. They were educated in the Egyptian court, taught to read and write, and raised to respect the pharaoh. When their fathers died, Thutmose sent these Egyptianized sons back to rule their home cities as loyal vassals. It was a brilliant long-term solution for imperial control. Megiddo was only the beginning. For the next 2 decades, Thutmose III led 17 separate military campaigns. He was relentless, a true warrior pharaoh who marched his army farther than any king before him. He crossed the Euphrates River, planting his victory marker on the edge of the known world. He turned Egypt from a kingdom into a true, feared, and fabulously wealthy empire, its coffers overflowing with foreign tribute. Late in his reign, he finally turned his attention to his stepmother, Hatshepsut. He ordered her images and name to be systematically erased from the temples, her statues smashed and buried. For centuries, this was seen as an act of petty, delayed revenge. But it was not. It was a cold, political calculation. By erasing her reign, he was securing his own dynasty. He was rewriting history to show an unbroken male line of succession. He was ensuring that no woman could ever again use her precedent to challenge the throne. It was the final ruthless move of a man who was, in every sense, the true conqueror of Egypt. The empire that Thutmose III forged was a machine for generating wealth. Gold now flowed into Egypt from the south, timber from the north, and tribute from the east. His grandson, Imhotep III, inherited this golden age and ruled over an Egypt of unparalleled opulence. His reign was not one of war, but of diplomacy and magnificent construction. The center of all this power was the god Ammonius Ra, the patron of Thebes and the divine father of the empire's kings. His priesthood had become an empire within an empire. Their temples owned a vast percentage of the land. Their high priest was as powerful as a general, and their wealth threatened to rival that of the pharaoh himself. This was the rigid, wealthy, and powerful Egypt inherited by the next king, Imhotep IV. He was not like his ancestors. He was not a warrior like Thutmose, nor a grand diplomat like his father. He was a thinker, a mystic, a radical. He looked at the vast, complex pantheon of Egyptian gods, the hawk-headed Horus, the jackal-headed Anubis, and above all, the unseen, all-powerful Ammonius, and he saw a lie. In the early years of his reign, he began to signal his change. He sponsored a new minor cult, that of the Aten. The Aten was not a god in human or animal form. It was the physical disk of the sun itself, the glowing circle in the sky whose rays gave warmth and life to all things. This was not just a preference. It was an obsession. And this obsession would soon become a revolution that would tear Egypt apart. We will never know his true motive. Was it a political masterstroke, a calculated attempt to break the immense power of the priesthood of Ammonius by declaring their god irrelevant? Or was he a true visionary, history's first monotheist, a man who had a genuine personal revelation that there was only one true God? The results suggest a fanatical belief. He declared that the Aten was not just the supreme god, but the only god. All other gods were false. This was a direct assault on the very foundation of Egyptian culture. His first act was to change his own name. He was born Amenhotep, meaning Ammonius is satisfied. He renounced this name and declared himself Akhenaten, he who is effective for the Aten. Then he unleashed a campaign of iconoclasm. He ordered the temples of Ammonius to be closed. He sent workers with chisels across the length of the empire to physically hack the name of Ammonius from monuments, tombs, and temples. He even attacked the word gods in the plural, ordering it to be erased wherever it was found. It was an attempt to wipe the past and the power of the priesthood from history. But his greatest act was yet to come. He could not rule from the city of Thebes, a city built by and for the god Ammonius. So, in the 5th year of his reign, he abandoned the traditional capital. He took his court, his followers, and his beautiful wife, Nefertiti, and moved to the middle of the desert, to a virgin site where no god had ever been worshipped. Here, he built a new, spectacular capital city from scratch. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today we call it Amarna. This city was as revolutionary as his religion. It was built around massive open-air temples, designed with no roofs, so that the rays of the Aten could shine directly upon the worshippers. And with this new religion came a new art. For 2,000 years, Egyptian art had been rigid and perfect. Pharaohs were always depicted as muscular, youthful, and godlike, frozen in timeless, formal poses. Akhenaten declared this art to be a lie. He commanded his artists to show the world as it really was, in all its strange imperfection. The Amarna style was shocking. Akhenaten himself was depicted not as a perfect hero, but as a strange, almost alien figure. With a long, thin skull, slender arms, a sagging belly, and wide, feminine hips. Historians still debate if this was a true physical likeness, perhaps caused by a genetic disorder, or if it was a new religious symbol, showing him as the father and mother of all life. For the first time in history, we see the royal family in intimate, casual moments. We see Akhenaten and Nefertiti riding a chariot, their children on their laps. We see them eating a meal. Most famously, we see the king and queen playing with their young daughters, their bodies relaxed as the rays of the Aten, each ending in a tiny hand, offer them the ankh, the symbol of life. His wife, Queen Nefertiti, was his partner in this revolution. She was not a quiet, background figure. She was shown as his near equal, a co-ruler in this new world, even depicted in the traditional pose of a pharaoh, smiting the enemies of Egypt. But while Akhenaten was composing hymns to his sun god and Nefertiti was ruling by his side, the empire that Thutmose III had bled for was falling apart. In the ruins of Akhenaten, archaeologists found a remarkable stash of clay tablets, known as the Amarna letters. They are the desperate diplomatic correspondence from vassal kings in Syria, Canaan, and Palestine. They write to their pharaoh, begging for help. They are being attacked. They need gold. They need soldiers. They plead. The king's lands are being lost. Akhenaten, the mystic, apparently did not answer. He was absorbed in his new truth. He had broken Marat on a cosmic scale. His religion was too abstract for the common people, who still secretly prayed to their old familiar household gods. The army was restless. The old priesthoods were waiting in the shadows. When Akhenaten died after 17 years of this revolutionary rule, his new world died with him. His city was abandoned to the desert. His art style vanished, and his religion was wiped from the earth by a kingdom desperate to forget the heretic. Akhenaten's revolution, his 17-year war against his own gods, had left a scar on the nation. His capital was abandoned, his new god was forgotten, and the empire in the Levant was crumbling. A void of power had been created, and the kingdom was desperate for order. The figure who symbolizes this restoration is the one whose name is now the most famous in history: Tutankhamun. He was a boy, perhaps Akhenaten's son, who was placed on the throne as a child. He was a puppet, but a powerful one. His entire purpose was to be the public face of the counter-revolution. His very name was changed from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, a living declaration that the heresy was over and the old gods had returned. While the boy king performed the rituals, the real power was held by the men who had survived Akhenaten's reign. The old vizier, I, and the commander of the armies, a brilliant and ruthless general named Horemheb. When Tutankhamun died young, and I ruled for only a few years, it was Horemheb, the soldier, who took the throne. Horemheb was a man of order and iron. He stabilized Egypt, tore down Akhenaten's monuments, and restored the military. But Horemheb had no son. He needed an heir who could continue his tough, pragmatic rule. He did not choose a blue-blooded noble. He chose his most trusted general, a man from a military family in the Delta. He chose a man named Ramesses. This was the birth of the 19th dynasty. This was not a family of mystic kings or elegant diplomats. This was a family of soldiers. The new pharaoh, Ramesses I, was already an old man. The true work fell to his son, Seti I. Seti I was a great warrior pharaoh in the mold of Thutmose III. He began the hard, bloody work of reclaiming Egypt's lost empire. He marched his armies back into Canaan and Syria, fighting to restore the fear and respect that Akhenaten had squandered. And at his side, he brought his son. This was the young Ramesses II, later known as Ramesses the Great. Ramesses II was not raised in the secluded luxury of a palace harem. He was raised in army camps. His character was forged by the march, the smell of dust, and the tactics of the chariot corps. His father, Seti I, made him co-regent when he was just a teenager, giving him real power and military command. When Seti I died, Ramesses did not need to consolidate his power. He already held it. He was not a mystic like Akhenaten. He was a charismatic, ambitious, and supremely confident commander, and he burned with a single desire: to finish the work his father had started. He wanted a legacy. He wanted to be the greatest pharaoh who had ever lived. And to do that, he had to overcome an enemy his ancestors had never faced. During the chaos of Akhenaten's reign, a new superpower had risen in the north. They were the Hittites, a fierce iron-wielding empire from the highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Hittites had swallowed up the territory in Syria that Egypt once claimed. The two empires were on a collision course. The flashpoint was a single, fortress city of immense strategic importance. Kadesh. Kadesh was the linchpin that controlled the trade routes to the Euphrates. Thutmose III had captured it, but it was now the central, forward base of the Hittite army. For Ramesses to call himself a conqueror, he had to take Kadesh. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses II assembled the largest army Egypt had ever seen. Over 20,000 men and 2,000 chariots were organized into 4 great divisions, named after the patron gods of the empire: Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Set. He marched this grand army north, confident of a swift and glorious victory. He was young, in his late 20s, and perhaps overconfident. As he approached Kadesh, his army was marching in a long, extended line, with the divisions separated by several miles. Ramesses himself rode at the head of the Ammonius division. His scouts captured 2 local Bedouin nomads, who were brought before the pharaoh. They claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. They told Ramesses exactly what he wanted to hear. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, was afraid. He had heard of the pharaoh's great army and had retreated, pulling his forces far to the north, near Aleppo. Ramesses believed them. It was a fatal mistake. He ordered his Ammonius division to push ahead, to set up camp on the plain just northwest of Kadesh, leaving the Ra division to catch up. He was exposed, his army divided. The Bedouins were liars. They were spies, sent by the Hittite king. The entire Hittite army, nearly 40,000 infantry and 3,000 heavy chariots, was not in Aleppo. They were hidden at that very moment, just on the other side of the city of Kadesh. As the Ra division, exhausted from the march, began to arrive on the plain, the trap was sprung. The Hittite chariot corps, which used heavier 3-man chariots, burst from their hiding place. They crashed into the center of the marching Ra division with terrifying force. The division was cut in 2. It disintegrated into pure blind panic. Soldiers dropped their weapons and fled. The Hittite chariots did not stop. They wheeled north, and now, in a massive thundering wave, they smashed directly into Ramesses's own camp, where the Ammonius division was still unpacking. The camp defenses were overrun. The pharaoh was trapped, his personal guard was being slaughtered, and his army was in full chaotic retreat. It was a perfect trap, a military disaster, and it seemed the great pharaoh's reign was about to end, almost before it had begun. Surrounded, betrayed by false intelligence, and abandoned by his fleeing troops, Ramesses II was a king with his back to the river. In this moment of total crisis, the pharaoh's character was revealed. A lesser man would have surrendered or been killed. But Ramesses was the son of a soldier, trained for this his entire life. What happened next is one of the greatest stories in Egyptian history, told not by a historian, but by the king himself. According to the official account, which Ramesses would later carve into stone, he was left alone with only his personal bodyguard. His great army had fled before him. Furious at their cowardice, the pharaoh turned to his divine father, the god Ammonius, and he prayed. "I have called upon you, my father Ammonius," he cried out, "and you have abandoned me." Then, filled with a divine rage, he single-handedly mounted his chariot. Victory in Thebes. He strapped on his armor and, alone, charged the 2,500 massed Hittite chariots that surrounded him. "I was like the god Baal in his moment of fury," his inscriptions proclaim. He charged the enemy line not once, but 6 separate times, cutting his way through the Hittite ranks like a griffin, scattering them with his sheer power. He was, in his own words, a god on earth, saving himself and his army while his soldiers watched in shame. This is the legend. The reality was likely just as desperate, but more human. Ramesses, a brave and capable commander, almost certainly led a ferocious personal countercharge. He and his loyal household troops, the elite Chardana mercenaries, created a pocket of resistance. They fought with the desperation of trapped men. This desperate stand bought them just enough time. The Hittites, who had broken formation to plunder the rich Egyptian camp, were disorganized. And at this critical moment, a new, unexpected force appeared on the battlefield. It was a contingent of Egyptian reserves, the Narmer, who had taken a different route and now arrived, fresh, crashing into the Hittites' flank. The tide had not turned, but it had stalled. The Hittite attack was blunted. The rest of Ramesses's scattered army, seeing the battle was not lost, began to rally. By evening, the Ta division finally arrived. The battle had devolved into a bloody, chaotic stalemate. The next day, both exhausted armies stared each other down, but neither had the strength to renew the fight. The Hittites remained masters of Kadesh. Ramesses had failed to take the city. But the Egyptian army was not destroyed, and the pharaoh was alive. He gathered his forces and marched them home. For any other king, this would have been a humiliating draw, a strategic failure. But for Ramesses II, it was the greatest opportunity of his life. He realized a profound truth. History is not what happens. It is what is remembered. And he, as pharaoh, controlled the memory of Egypt. When he returned, he did not admit to a stalemate. He declared the Battle of Kadesh as the single greatest, most heroic victory in the history of the world. He was the hero. He, alone, had faced the entire Hittite horde and defeated them. He commissioned a heroic epic, the Poem of Pentor, to tell this glorious and mostly fictional version of the story. And then he did something unprecedented. He did not just write it on a papyrus scroll. He ordered it carved in massive, sprawling detail on the stone walls of every major temple in Egypt, at Luxor, at Karnak, at his own mortuary temple. The message was everywhere. Visitors to the temples would stand in awe before giant reliefs of Ramesses, 10 times the size of any other man, his chariot riding over a sea of dead Hittites. It was the most effective and widespread propaganda campaign in ancient history. He had turned a military failure into a personal triumph that would define his reign. He had learned that the image of power was, in many ways, more important than power itself. This obsession with image and legacy drove the second half of his reign. He would become the greatest builder in Egyptian history, not just of new temples, but of his own image. He built vast additions to the temples at Karnak and Luxor. He founded a new, magnificent capital in the delta, Ramesses. And far to the south, in the conquered land of Nubia, he executed his masterpiece. He ordered his engineers to carve a temple directly from the face of a mountain. This was Abu Simbel. It was not a temple in the traditional sense. It was a monument of intimidation and self-glorification. Guarding its entrance are 4 colossal 66-foot-tall statues of the pharaoh himself, seated on his throne, staring into eternity. The local Nubians and any approaching army would be left with no doubt as to who was their master. Inside, the grand hall is lined with more statues of Ramesses, as the god Osiris. And on the back wall, in the most sacred place, are 4 statues of the gods. One is Ammonius. One is Ta, one is Ra, and the 4th, it is Ramesses himself, deified, sitting as an equal among the gods. He even designed the temple so that twice a year, on his birthday and coronation day, the solar alignment would cause the rising sun to penetrate 180 feet into the mountain, illuminating the faces of all the gods, including his own. The war with the Hittites dragged on for another 16 years, with no decisive victory for either side. Both empires were exhausted. Finally, Ramesses the master propagandist showed he was also Ramesses the pragmatist. In 1258 BC, he signed a treaty with the new Hittite king. This document, the Eternal Treaty of Kadesh, is the first ever international peace treaty in human history whose text survives. It was a non-aggression pact, a defensive alliance, and an extradition treaty. It was incredibly, shockingly modern. To seal this new peace, Ramesses married a Hittite princess, who became one of his great royal wives. The soldier had finally become a statesman. He ruled for an astonishing 66 years, a reign of almost unheard of length. He had over 100 children, outliving most of them. By the time he died, in his early 90s, most people in Egypt had never known another pharaoh. He was not just a king. He was Egypt. He had so thoroughly covered the land in his own image that he became the benchmark for all future kings, the great ancestor, and the very definition of a pharaoh. The death of Ramesses the Great left a shadow so vast that no successor could escape it. He had ruled for so long and built so much that he had become the very image of kingship. His many sons and grandsons who followed him were weak imitations, a long line of lesser kings who all took his name, hoping to borrow his glory. But the world had changed. Ramesses had fought the Hittites to a standstill, but a new mysterious threat was rising from the Mediterranean. They are known to history only as the Sea Peoples, a wave of unknown migratory warriors who smashed the great empires of the age. The Hittite Empire vanished. The cities of the Levant burned. Egypt itself was invaded, and though it fought them off, the effort was crippling. The empire of Thutmose and Ramesses fractured. The great unity forged by Narmer finally broke. For the next 1,000 years, Egypt entered a long, slow twilight. It became a prize, not a power. It was ruled by Libyan kings from the desert. It was conquered by the Nubian kings from the south, who saw themselves as restorers of the old traditions. It was broken by the sheer, brutal power of the Assyrian Empire. And finally, it was absorbed into the largest empire the world had ever seen, the Persian Empire. For 2 centuries, the pharaoh was a distant king in Persia. The Black Land had become a mere province, its grain and gold feeding a foreign master. Then, in 332 BC, a new conqueror arrived, a man who would change the world: Alexander the Great. The young Macedonian king was sweeping across the Persian Empire, and when he arrived in Egypt, the people did not see him as another invader. They welcomed him as a liberator. Alexander was a political genius. He understood that to hold Egypt, he must become Egyptian. He did not rule with a Persian lash. Instead, he traveled through the desert to the remote oasis of Siwa, to the oracle of the god Ammonius. There, the priests, no doubt sensing the shift in power, declared him the true son of Ammonius, the rightful pharaoh. He founded a new, magnificent capital on the coast, a Greek-style city he named after himself, Alexandria. And then he left, driving east to finish his conquest of the world. He would die in Babylon, having never returned. His vast empire, built on his personal genius, shattered upon his death. His generals, all ruthless and ambitious Macedonians, fell upon the pieces. The one who claimed the richest prize, Egypt, was his most cunning and cautious general, Ptolemy Soter. Ptolemy founded a new dynasty. But this was not an Egyptian dynasty. It was a Greek one. This is the single most important fact for understanding the world we are about to enter. For the next 300 years, Egypt was ruled by a foreign family, the Ptolemies. They did not rule from the ancient capital of Memphis. They ruled from the new gleaming marble city of Alexandria, a city that was, in reality, a slice of Greece transplanted onto the African coast. They spoke Greek. They ran their administration in Greek. They built the great library, the largest in the world, and filled it with Greek scrolls. To the native Egyptian people, they performed the ancient duties. They built magnificent new temples, like the ones at Edfu and Dendera. On the walls of these temples, they had themselves carved in the traditional style, wearing the double crown and smiting Egypt's enemies. But in their private lives, they were purely Macedonian. They married not for love or even for alliance, but for power, almost exclusively marrying their own siblings. Brother married sister, generation after generation, to keep the divine bloodline and the wealth pure. For 2 centuries, their wealth was almost unimaginable. They treated Egypt as a personal estate, a vast plantation whose only purpose was to generate gold and grain to fund their political ambitions and their luxurious, often decadent, lives in Alexandria. But the dynasty rot from within. The later Ptolemies were known for their corruption, obesity, and spectacular cruelty. The family was consumed by paranoia, civil war, and assassinations. And as the Ptolemies weakened, a new superpower was rising across the Mediterranean. It was not a kingdom, but a republic, a nation of soldiers and senators with an insatiable appetite for power: Rome. By the 1st century BC, Egypt was no longer an empire. It was a client state. Its independence was a polite fiction, allowed to exist only because Rome found it convenient. The Ptolemies were puppets, holding their throne only by paying colossal bribes to Roman senators and generals. Egypt's only remaining power was its immense wealth and, most critically, its grain. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and whoever controlled Egypt could feed the Roman mob, and thus control Rome. This was the world into which Cleopatra VII was born, in 69 BC. She was not the timeless Egyptian queen of popular imagination. She was a Macedonian Greek princess, a product of centuries of ambition, inbreeding, and a dynasty in its death throes. Her father was Ptolemy XII, a man so despised by his own people for his weakness and his groveling to Rome that they nicknamed him Auletes, the flute player. He was a decadent, incompetent ruler who was, at one point, literally kicked out of Egypt by the Alexandrian mob. He was forced to travel to Rome, a beggar king, borrowing vast sums to bribe the Roman Senate to send an army to put him back on his throne. This is the lesson Cleopatra learned as a child. She watched her father's humiliation. She watched her ambitious older sisters plot and fail. She grew up in a palace where siblings were rivals, and murder was a tool of statecraft. She learned 2 things. Her family was collapsing, and the only real power in the world came from Rome. She was born into a crisis. The throne she would inherit was poisoned, the kingdom was bankrupt, and the shadow of the Roman wolf was falling over the land. When the flute player, Ptolemy XII, finally died, he did exactly what the Romans had advised. He left his chaotic kingdom in his will to his 2 eldest surviving children: his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra, and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were to rule together as husband and wife. This arrangement, meant to stabilize the throne, instead ignited a fire. The 10-year-old boy was weak and controllable. He was a perfect puppet for the powerful men who ran the court: the eunuch Pothinus, his chief minister, and Achilles, the commander of the army. They saw Cleopatra, however, as a profound threat. She was not like the rest of her decadent, isolated family. She was brilliant. She was ambitious. And she had done something so shocking, so unprecedented, that it revealed her entire character. She was the first ruler in the entire 300-year history of the Ptolemaic Dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language. While her ancestors had barricaded themselves inside their Greek city, Cleopatra had studied. She was a polyglot, reportedly speaking 9 languages. She understood that her family's power, which they had long taken for granted, was a fiction. The only way to save her dynasty was to close the 300-year gap between the Greek throne and the native Egyptian people. She began to present herself not just as a Greek queen, but as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. The old guard of the court could not control a woman like this. She was too smart, too popular, and too dangerous. So, Pothinus and Achilles chose the puppet. They systematically turned her brother against her, using the power of the army to isolate her. In 48 BC, Cleopatra was forced to flee her own capital, an exiled queen, driven out by her own brother's ministers. She did not, however, accept defeat. She fled to Syria, and with her characteristic energy, she began to raise her own mercenary army. A civil war was now inevitable. The two sibling spouses were preparing to fight for the ultimate prize, a bankrupt kingdom that was itself a puppet of Rome. But just as this internal war was about to begin, the Roman world exploded, and its civil war came crashing onto Egypt's shores. Far away, the two most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, had fought a decisive battle at Pharsalus in Greece. Caesar had won a stunning victory. Pompey, his great rival, fled the battlefield, defeated and desperate. He sailed for the one place he believed he was safe, Egypt. He had been the patron of Cleopatra's father. He was the man who had restored the flute player to his throne. He expected loyalty. He sailed into the harbor of Alexandria. The young king, Ptolemy XIII, and his advisors, Pothinus and Achilles, watched him arrive. They were faced with a terrible choice. To side with Pompey, the loser, would be to invite the wrath of the victor, Caesar. So they made a fatal miscalculation. Believing they were being pragmatic, they chose to curry favor with the winner. As Pompey stepped off his ship into a small boat, he was met by one of his own former soldiers. As they neared the beach, the men drew their swords and stabbed him to death, in full view of his wife and children on the ship. They cut off his head and pickled it in brine, a grotesque gift for the new master of the world. A few days later, Julius Caesar arrived, in hot pursuit. He landed in Alexandria with a small, confident force and marched to the palace. There, Ptolemy's advisors presented him with their gift, the head of Pompey. Caesar's reaction was not what they expected. He was horrified. This was not some barbarian chieftain. This was Pompey the Great, a Roman consul, a hero of the Republic, and Caesar's former son-in-law. Ptolemy's court had not won Caesar's favor. They had given him the perfect moral and legal pretext to intervene. He seized the royal palace, declared himself the executor of Ptolemy XII's will, and summoned the two rival monarchs, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, to his presence. This was Cleopatra's moment of crisis. Her brother was in the palace with Caesar. She was outside the city, locked out, her army useless against Roman legions. She was checkmated. She could not fight her way in. She could not negotiate her way in. Her solution is perhaps the most brilliant, high-stakes political gamble in history. She knew she had one weapon her 10-year-old brother did not: herself, her intellect, her charm, and her sheer audacious courage. She traveled to Alexandria in secret. She had a trusted merchant, Apollodorus of Sicily, wrap her not in a luxurious carpet, as legend says, but more likely in a sturdy, common bedroll or sack. He slung this sack over his shoulder, claiming he had a gift for Caesar, and walked directly past her brother's guards. He was granted entry to Caesar's private quarters, where he unrolled the bundle. Out tumbled the 22-year-old, exiled queen of Egypt. It is easy to see this as an act of seduction, but it was far more. It was a stroke of strategic genius. She bypassed the entire power structure of her rival's court. She presented herself, vulnerable but defiant, directly to the only man whose opinion mattered. The 52-year-old Caesar, a man who understood and admired bold ambition above all else, was captivated. That night, she did not just offer him her love. She offered him a deal. She, a brilliant, multilingual queen who actually knew her country, could be his loyal, stable ally on the Nile. She would give him what he needed most: her family's immense wealth to pay his legions, and Egypt's endless supply of grain to feed Rome. In return, he would give her what she needed: his army to crush her brother and win her throne. Caesar agreed. When Pothinus and the young Ptolemy XIII realized they had been outmaneuvered, they unleashed their army on Caesar. Thus began the Alexandrine War, a brutal 9-month conflict. Caesar was trapped in the palace. besieged by his own supposed allies. In the fighting, parts of the city burned, and with it a portion of the great library. But the Roman legions, though outnumbered, were disciplined and unstoppable. They broke the siege. Ptolemy XII's army was smashed, and the young king, trying to flee across the Nile, drowned, dragged to the bottom by the weight of his own golden armor. Caesar was now the undisputed master of Egypt. He did not make it a Roman province. A loyal client king was more useful. He fulfilled his part of the bargain. He placed Cleopatra back on the throne. To maintain a shred of Egyptian tradition, he had her marry her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but this boy was a phantom. The true alliance was sealed in flesh and blood. Soon after, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, but who the people of Alexandria called by a perfect nickname, Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was her ultimate triumph, a son who was, in his blood, both the heir to the pharaohs and the only son of the most powerful man in the world. With her brother dead and her son, Caesarion, at her side, Cleopatra had won. She was the undisputed ruler of Egypt, her throne secured by the legions of Rome. Her alliance with Julius Caesar was more than political. It was a personal bond that had produced an heir to both their worlds. To cement this victory, she did something her ancestors would never have dared. She left Egypt. She traveled to Rome itself, not as a conquered vassal, but as a friend and ally of the Roman people. She lived in Caesar's private villa outside the city, a tangible symbol of his power and his exotic conquests. But the Romans hated her. To the conservative, old guard senators, she was everything they despised. She was a queen, a word that to them meant tyrant. She was an Eastern monarch, dripping in a luxury they found decadent and offensive. She was, in their eyes, the foreign mistress who was corrupting their great dictator. When Caesar placed a golden statue of her, as the goddess Isis, in the Temple of Venus, it was a scandal that confirmed their worst fears. Cleopatra, for her part, seems to have underestimated the danger. She was arrogant, a queen in a city that had built its entire identity on destroying kings. Then, on the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, her entire world was shattered. Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed to death on the floor of the Roman Senate by a conspiracy of men who called themselves liberators. For Cleopatra, this was a catastrophe. Her protector was dead. She was alone in a hostile city with her son, Caesarion, a son who was a living, breathing threat to the men who had just murdered his father. Her alliance had vanished overnight. She fled Rome in a panic and sailed back to Alexandria. Once again, her kingdom was in peril. The Roman world, which Caesar had finally stabilized, was plunged back into a new vicious civil war. On one side were Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. On the other, the men who swore to avenge him. This new alliance was led by two very different men. The first was Gaius Octavian. He was Caesar's grandnephew, a sickly but intensely brilliant, cold and calculating 19-year-old. In his will, Caesar had adopted him as his son and named him his primary heir. Octavian was the future. The second was Mark Antony. He was Caesar's most flamboyant and loyal general, a hard-drinking, charismatic, and emotional soldier who was adored by the legions. Antony was the present. For the next few years, as these two men first hunted down Caesar's killers and then began to circle each other, Cleopatra played a dangerous game. She remained in Egypt officially neutral, trying to rebuild her strength, and waiting to see which new Roman warlord would end up on top. After the assassins were defeated at the Battle of Philippi, the two victors divided the world. Octavian, the politician, returned to Rome to rule the difficult, chaotic West. Antony, the soldier, took the glamorous and wealthy East. This made Mark Antony the new master of Cleopatra's world. He was in Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey, trying to raise money for a long-dreamed-of invasion of Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival. He needed ships. He needed grain. And he needed gold. Cleopatra, the richest woman in the world, had all three. He sent her a summons. She was to present herself before him and explain her neutrality in the recent wars. It was a test. A summons from a Roman general to a client queen. Cleopatra knew this was her second great gamble. She could not fail. She had met Antony before, years earlier in Rome. She knew his character. He was not the cold, pragmatic Caesar. He was not an accountant or a politician. He was a man of grand appetites, a lover of spectacle, a man who saw himself as a new Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. She knew, instinctively, that to approach this man as a humble, begging vassal would be a mistake. It would invite his contempt. So she would not come to him as a client. She would come to him as a goddess. Her response to his summons was a masterpiece of political theater. Antony waited for her in the public square of Tarsus, seated on his tribunal, ready to receive her as a superior. But Cleopatra did not arrive. She sailed up the river Cydnus, and she had her scouts tell the people of the city to come to the harbor instead. She arrived at dusk, in a scene of breathtaking, calculated fantasy. Her royal barge was a floating palace. Its sails were a deep, royal purple. Its oars were silver, striking the water to the sound of flutes and lyres. The deck was wreathed in flowers and clouds of exotic perfume, so thick they could be smelled from the shore, drifted over the water. And there, on the deck, dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess of love, lay Cleopatra herself, fanned by servants disguised as cupids. The entire city, and Antony himself, left the marketplace and ran to the harbor to see the spectacle. The hard-bitten Roman general, who saw himself as a god, was now looking at a woman who had become one. He had summoned her, but she had forced him to come to her. That night, she invited him to a banquet on her ship, a feast so impossibly luxurious that it made his own Roman camp look shabby. Antony was captivated. He was 40 years old, a man in his prime, and he had met his match. Where Caesar had been charmed by her audacity, Antony was swept away by her glamour. Where Caesar had made a cool political alliance, Antony began a passionate, all-consuming love affair. He abandoned his planned invasion of Parthia. He abandoned his political duties. And he followed her like a man in a dream, back to Alexandria. He spent the entire winter of 41 BC with her. They formed a private club, the Inimitable Livers, and spent their nights feasting, drinking, and wandering the city streets in disguise. For Antony, it was an escape into a world of pleasure he had always craved. For Cleopatra, it was a political triumph. She had captured the new master of the East. She was safe again. But this alliance, built on passion and spectacle, was not like the one she had made with Caesar. It was exclusive. It forced the Roman world to choose. And in Rome, the cold, calculating, and brilliant young Octavian was watching. He saw Antony's decadence not as a weakness, but as the perfect weapon. He began a masterful propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a drunken, un-Roman fool, bewitched by a foreign whore queen who planned to rule Rome from Alexandria. The final conflict was not yet here, but the battle lines had been drawn. The alliance between Antony and Cleopatra was no longer just a romance or a military pact. It was a new center of power. While Octavian in Rome was struggling to pay his veterans and fighting political battles, Antony and Cleopatra ruled from Alexandria over a domain that was vast, wealthy, and stable. Antony was a Roman general, but he had become an Eastern king. And in 34 BC, they made their move. It was an act of such staggering political arrogance that it made war inevitable. They staged a grand public spectacle in the heart of Alexandria, a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones, dressed as the gods Osiris and Isis. At their feet sat their children, and beside them Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar. Before the assembled crowds, Antony made a series of declarations. First, he proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings. Then, he declared Caesarion to be the true, legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar. This was a direct mortal insult to Octavian, whose entire power base rested on his title as Caesar's adopted son. Then, Antony proceeded to donate vast territories of the Roman world to his children with Cleopatra. He named one son king of Armenia, another king of Syria, and his daughter queen of Libya. These were not his lands to give. He was acting as a conqueror, dividing up the spoils of an empire he had not yet won. When news of this reached Rome, Octavian had the perfect weapon. He portrayed this not as a political squabble, but as a holy war. He painted Antony as a man who had gone native, a Roman traitor who had been bewitched by an Eastern sorceress. He claimed Antony intended to move the capital of the entire Roman world from Rome to Alexandria. The Senate was outraged. Octavian, in a brilliant, sacrilegious move, illegally seized Antony's last will and testament from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read it aloud. The will confirmed all of Rome's fears. It requested that Antony, no matter where he died, be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra. The Senate stripped Antony of his titles. But Octavian was too cunning to declare war on Antony. That would be another Roman civil war, which the people dreaded. Instead, in 32 BC, he declared war only on Cleopatra. This was not a civil war, he argued, but a foreign war, a defense of Roman values against a decadent, power-hungry Egyptian queen. The final conflict, the war for control of the entire known world, was set. The two sides met in 31 BC, at Actium, on the western coast of Greece. It was a naval battle. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet, over 500 heavy, powerful warships. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant, low-born general Marcus Agrippa, was smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable. The battle itself was, for a long time, a stalemate. Antony's large ships were like floating fortresses, difficult to ram, but also slow and clumsy. Agrippa's lighter vessels darted in and out, harassing them, trying to find an opening. Then, in the middle of the battle, the unexplained happened. A squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, held in reserve and commanded by Cleopatra herself, suddenly raised its sails, a signal for retreat, not combat. The squadron broke through the lines and sailed south, fleeing the battle. Antony, who was on his flagship in the thick of the fighting, saw her leave. And in that moment, he made the most debated and most fatal decision of his life. He was the commander of the most powerful navy in the East. His men were fighting and dying for him. But he was no longer a Roman general. He was Cleopatra's. He abandoned his flagship. He transferred to a small, fast vessel and with a handful of his men, he raced after her. He abandoned his entire army. For his men, watching their general flee the field of battle, it was the ultimate betrayal. Their morale shattered. The fleet, left leaderless, was systematically surrounded and destroyed by Agrippa. The land army, which had watched the disaster from the shore, surrendered a few days later. It was not a defeat. It was a total collapse. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria. They were broken. They spent their last year in the capital, the inimitable livers, now calling themselves the companions to the death. Octavian, cold and methodical, did not rush. He spent a year securing his power, and then in 30 BC, he invaded Egypt. The country, whose defense rested entirely on Antony's reputation, did not put up a fight. Antony's legions, the very men he had led for decades, deserted and joined Octavian. Antony, hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra had already killed herself, decided to die like a Roman. He asked his servant to hold a sword so he could fall upon it. The servant, in loyalty, killed himself instead. Antony, in shame, then fell on his own sword, but he bungled the attempt. He was mortally wounded, but not dead. In agony, he heard that Cleopatra was, in fact, alive. She had barricaded herself in her great mausoleum, a tomb she had built for this very purpose. Antony's last, dying wish was to be taken to her. His guards carried his bleeding body to the mausoleum. Cleopatra, afraid to open the doors, lowered ropes from a window, and she and her attendants pulled the dying general up the side of the building. He died in her arms, a Roman titan reduced to a tragic, ruined lover. Octavian's soldiers entered the city and captured Cleopatra. This was the moment Octavian had dreamed of. He did not want her dead. He wanted her alive. He needed her for his triumph in Rome, the grand military parade where he would march her through the streets in golden chains, the living symbol of his victory and the end of the war. Cleopatra, the descendant of Alexander, the daughter of kings, the mother of Caesar's son, knew this. She feigned cooperation. She asked Octavian only for permission to make an offering at Antony's tomb. Then she returned to her chambers. She bathed, put on her finest royal robes, and ordered a feast. According to the story that became immortal, a servant brought her a simple basket of figs. Hidden beneath the leaves was an asp, a small venomous Egyptian cobra, the sacred symbol of the pharaoh's power over life and death. To be paraded in Rome was to be humiliated. To die by her own hand, by the bite of a pharaoh's sacred animal, was to claim one final divine victory. She robbed Octavian of his prize. When his guards, growing suspicious, broke down her doors, they found her dead on her golden couch, dressed as the goddess Isis, with her 2 loyal handmaidens dying at her feet. Octavian, furious but respectful, had her buried with full honors beside Antony. His victory was complete, but she had denied him his triumph. His soldiers found her 17-year-old son, Caesarion, and murdered him on the cold advice that there was no room in the world for 2 Caesars. The dynasty of the Ptolemies was over. The 3,000-year-old age of the pharaohs was finished. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, the land of Narmer and Khufu and Thutmose and Ramesses, became a Roman province, the personal property of Octavian, who would soon be known by a new name, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome.